let's go on. Whether the independence of the continent was declared too soon or delayed too long, I will now enter into as an argument. My own simple opinion is that had it been 8 months earlier, it would have been much better. We did not make a proper use of last winter. Neither could we while we were in a dependent state. However, the fault, if it were one, was all our own. We have none to blame but ourselves. Now, see, he puts the blame on them, doesn't blame someone else, calls it out on them. But he gives them hope, right, and encourages them. He says, but no great deal is lost yet. All that Howe has been doing for this past month is rather a ravage than a conquest, which the spirit of the Jerseys a year ago would have quickly repulsed, and which time and a little resolution will soon recover. So he sees hope, right? We can get this back. Don't worry. I have as little superstition in me as any man living, but my secret opinion has ever been and still is that God Almighty will not give up a people to military destruction or leave them unsupportedly to perish, who have earnestly and so repeatedly sought to avoid the calamities of war by every decent method which wisdom can invent. Neither have I so much of the infidel in me as to suppose that he has relinquished the government of the world and given us up to the care of devils. And as I do not, I cannot see what grounds the King of Britain can look up to heaven for help against a common murderer, a highwayman, or a housebreaker, has as good a pretense as he. 'Tis surprising to see how rapidly a panic will sometimes run through a country. So we'll stop here real quickly. Now, we've seen that, right? That's relevant today. So this could have been written today because we just saw that. It's surprising to see how rapidly a panic will sometimes run through a country. We saw that. We've seen it through history. So you have to watch and be weary of these panics. And when you're in fear or when there's a panic, why would you trade freedom for the illusion of security? You've got freedom or the illusion of security. And who would gain from it? Liberty for the illusion of security to someone who may not know what they're doing, who does not have the answer, who does not have good intentions, or maybe a few people do, but it will have a bad outcome and cost you freedom. If they take your ability to work away, is that affecting your property? Right to property, right to life, right to liberty. Those were the principles they were fighting for. If someone, a government bureaucrat or a government official, tells you you can't do things without changing the law because it's a crisis or emergency, are they assaulting your liberty, your God-given rights? All nations and ages have been subject to them. Britain has trembled like an ague at the report of a French fleet of flat-bottomed boats, and in the 14th, 15th century, the whole English army, after ravaging the kingdom of France, was driven back like men petrified with fear. And this brave exploit was performed by a few broken forces collected and headed by a woman, Joan of Arc. Would that heaven might inspire some Jersey maid to spirit up her countrymen and save her fellow sufferers from ravage and ravishment. Yet panics, in some cases, he says, have their uses. They produce as much good as hurt. So What have you learned from the last panic that we went through? What can you learn? Have you identified the patterns? What will you see next? Do you look into it? Do you research it? Do you find out more? What's the new fear going to be? Who would gain from a new fear? Who would gain power from a new fear? Who would gain control, wealth? So if we can learn and come out of this with good, he's saying. If you talk about it to others and expose it and state the truth to others, more people will be aware, right? If you see a pattern and identify it and you tell that to people, more people will be aware of their God-given rights and be willing to stand for them. Their duration is always short. The mind soon grows through them and acquires a firmer habit than before. So is your mind seeing the patterns? Is it growing from it? So have you studied history where totalitarians sold security as power and named it the opposite? Remember the Reichstag fire? How they sold safety to increase their power? What about the French Revolution, the Committee of Public Safety? Wouldn't you feel very safe with that committee? But notice the language they use. So pay attention to the language. Words safety, crisis, emergency, and for you. Many times it's just for more power, control, and destruction of your rights. But their peculiar advantage is that they are the touchstones of sincerity and hypocrisy, and bring things and men to light, which might otherwise have lain forever undiscovered. So that's very relevant to today, right? That one is very relevant. You have seen this. You've seen things in men brought to light. Think back, reflect, and then see how much has come to light that you may have thought was otherwise. That they are the touchstones of sincerity and hypocrisy and bring things in men to light, which might otherwise have lain forever undiscovered. That's a good one, right? I mean, that is so relevant. But it's up to you people to point out to others and show the light. Ask questions, show the patterns to people. Put it together for others so they can see this leads to this, and it happens again and again. In fact, they have the same effect on secret traders, which an imaginary apparition would have upon a private murderer. They sift out the hidden thoughts of man and hold them up in public to the world. And you've seen that revealed, right? As the facts come out, and as everything that's occurred, you've seen this happen. And the actions you've seen. Many a disguised Tory has lately shown his head that shall penitentially solemnize with curses the day on which Howe arrived upon the Delaware. And who were the Tories? They were the ones who sided with the crown against the Americans. And if you saw, and a lot of them just didn't get in the fight. They stayed on the sidelines. They actually just wanted to watch Britain win and keep their title and their possessions. A lot of them had a title in a good position in America. Some didn't, though. Many didn't get in the fight, but some were the worst. You had that movie, The Patriot, with Mel Gibson, where some of the worst are the Tories who were burning the houses, right? As I was with the troops at Fort Lee and marched with them to the edge of Pennsylvania, I am well acquainted with many circumstances, which those who live at a distance know but little or nothing of. Our situation there was exceedingly cramped, the place being a narrow neck of land between the North River and the Hackensack. Our force was inconsiderable, being not 1/4 so great as Howe could bring against us. We had no army in hand to have relieved the garrison. Had we shut ourselves up and stood on our defense, our ammunition, light artillery, and the best part of our stores had been removed on the apprehension that Howe would endeavor to penetrate the Jerseys, in which case Fort Lee could be of no use to us. For it must occur to every thinking man, whether in the army or not, that these kinds of field forts are only for temporary purposes and last in use no longer than the enemy directs his force against that particular object, which such forts are raised to defend. Such was our situation and condition at Fort Lee on the morning of the 20th of November, when an officer arrived with information that the enemy with 200 boats had landed about 7 miles above. Major General Nathaniel Greene, who commanded the garrison, immediately ordered them under arms and sent express to General Washington at the town of Hackensack, distant, by the way, of the ferry, 6 miles. Our first object was to secure the bridge over the Hackensack, which laid up the river between the enemy and us, about 6 miles from us and 3 from them. General Washington arrived in about 3/4 of an hour and marched at the head of troops toward the bridge, which place I expected we should have a brush for. However, they did not choose to dispute it with us. So let's stop here and talk about the great General George Washington. Outstanding. And what he did. He arrived rapidly, right? So he gets there fast. Washington was a man of action. And notice this. Did he stay at the back on the side? No, he led from the front. And he does that many times throughout history. He does that right after this at the crossing and Princeton. So he was a phenomenal leader and inspired men. Led from the front. He had valor. He was a true leader. He inspired the men. Role model for men. If you're looking for a role model, and men need role models, George Washington is one. We'll do one on him one day. And the greatest part of our troops went over the bridge and the rest over the ferry, except some which passed at a mill on a small creek between the bridge and the ferry and made their way through some marshy grounds up to the town of Hackensack and there passed the river. We brought off as much baggage as the wagons could contain. The rest was lost. The simple object was to bring off the garrison and march them on till they could be strengthened by the Jersey or Pennsylvania militia. So they're trying to get out of there so they can get help, right? So as to being able to make a stand. We stayed 4 days at Newark, collected our outposts with some of the Jersey militia, and marched out twice to meet the enemy. On being informed that they were advancing, though our numbers were greatly inferior to theirs. So they had courage, right? They marched out twice to meet them with inferior numbers. These men had bravery. Howe, in my little opinion, committed a great error in generalship in not throwing a body of forces off from Staten Island through Amboy, by which means he might have seized all our stores in Brunswick. So he thinks Howe made a great mistake in not doing that and intercepted our march into Pennsylvania. But if we believe the power of hell to be limited, we must likewise believe that their agents are under some providential control. So God's playing a role. And you see that through the founders. Providence. See a lot of providence, by the way, if we get to the Washington video in his life. I shall not now attempt to give all the particulars of our retreat to the Delaware. Suffice it for the present to say that both officers and men, though greatly harassed and fatigued, frequently without rest, covering, or provision, the inevitable consequences of a long retreat, bore it with a manly and a martial spirit. So let's just stop here for a second. So greatly harassed, fatigued, without covering, very hungry, without provisions. They bore it with what? Manly and martial spirit. All their wishes centered in one, which was that the country would turn out and help them to drive the enemy back. Voltaire has remarked that King William never appeared to full advantage, but in difficulties and in action. The same remark may be made on General Washington, for the character fits him. There's a natural firmness in some minds which cannot be unlocked by trifles, but which, when unlocked, discovers a cabinet of fortitude. And I reckon it among those kinds of public blessings which we do not immediately see, that God has blessed him with uninterrupted health and given him a mind that can even flourish upon care. So Washington, and this is true if you've read his biographies, flourished. So that's an accurate description of Washington. He had fortitude. He did well under adversity. He flourished in it. Circumstances didn't prevent him from taking action, like he did later after this with the crossing. He was such a leader, such a hero. And you have to ask yourself, without Washington, where would we be today? Because this man flourished under difficult times. And he didn't have to do it, by the way. He was the wealthiest Virginian. But he wanted freedom. He wanted what was right. And he was willing to fight and die for it. One man had an impact and made a difference. And so can you. He goes on, I shall conclude this paper with some miscellaneous remarks on the state of our affairs, and shall begin with asking the following question. Why is it that the enemy have left the New England provinces and made these middle ones the seat of war? The answer is easy. New England is not infested with Tories, and we are. I have been tender in raising the cry against these men and used numberless arguments to show them their danger. But it will not do to sacrifice a world either to their folly or their baseness. The period has now arrived in which either they or we must change our sentiments, or one or both must fall. And what is a Tory? Good God, what is he? I shall not be afraid to go with 100 Whigs against 1,000 Tories, were they to attempt to get into arms. Every Tory is a coward. Servile, slavish, self-interested fear is the foundation of Toryism, and a man under such influence, though he may be cruel, can never be brave. But before the line of irrecoverable separation be drawn between us, let us reason the matter together. Your conduct is an invitation to the enemy. Yet not 1 in 1,000 of you has heart enough to join him. Howe is as much deceived by you as the American cause is injured by you. He expects you will all take up arms and flock to his standard with muskets on your shoulders. Your opinions of him, your opinions are of no use to him, lest you support him personally, for 'tis soldiers and not Tories that he wants. I once felt all that kind of anger which man ought to feel against the mean principles that are held by the Tories, and noted one who kept a tavern at Amboy, was standing at the door with as pretty a child in his hand, about 8 or 9 years old, as I ever saw. And after speaking his mind as freely as he thought was prudent, finished with this unfatherly expression. Well, give me peace in my day. Not a man lives on the continent but fully believes that a separation must sometime or other finally take place. And a generous parent should have said what? If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace. And this single reflection, well applied, is sufficient to awaken every man to duty. So he tells the story to wake up. What's he saying? Wake up. You're not going to have peace. You may think you're going to have peace, but it's not going to be peace. And if you think you just want peace, you're turning it over to your children. Maybe you will get a little peace temporarily. But then what are you putting your children into? So if you give up pieces of freedom for peace, or the temporary illusion of peace, you're trading a little peace for what? Tyranny. You got to stand for freedom now and not put the children into tyranny.